And here we have it. So today we are happy to welcome Tom Walker and actually we're welcoming him back. This is his second webinar this winter for us. He's a graduate of the University of Massachusetts, Amherst, and he has spent several seasons surveying wildlife on the West Coast for the U.S. Forest Service and Bureau of Land Management. And he's got lots of interest and has led walks for us and will be doing a walk for us upcoming. I have to look at that date, but I think it should be on our next slide, maybe. Yep, here, there it is, Sunday, July 9th. He'll be doing a tree identification walk for us at Barclays Pond. And here on this slide, you can see some of the other trail walks we'll be hosting this spring. Our website has all of the information you need, so please check there. Sign up for our e-newsletter to stay abreast of new opportunities that are coming up. Follow us on Facebook because we're always posting there, and become a member. And now I am going to turn it over to Tom. Oh, just a couple of housekeeping things. I ask everyone to stay on mute. We are recording this, so it will go into our library. So if you want to see it again, you can catch it there. Tom has provided us with all our slides. And so Tom has provided us with all the slides, so we'll send those as a follow-up. And if you have any questions, you can put them in the chat box, and we can at the end take some questions. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Tom.
All right, so get this out of the view here. All right, thank you for joining us. Like you said, this is a presentation on tree identification for Cape Cod. It's just Cape Cod only. Cape Cod is very different soils than inland, so we get different trees. We do get some of the same trees, but a lot of trees you're going to find inland you won't find here on Cape Cod. So we'll just get started, and this is just a black cherry that's in bloom, and that's a pretty tree to see when it's flowering. And then I'm having trouble advancing. For some reason, I cannot advance the slides. What happened there? Okay, having some oh, there we go. Okay, so the first question, is it a tree or a shrub? You want to eliminate as many different options as you can because there's quite a few trees. We're going to look at about 40 species. So if you can eliminate the shrubs, then that'll make it easier. So trees have one main
Tom, your slides aren't up yet. I'm going to try to do that screen share one more time.
Okay. That up.
It's like the big green button at the bottom. If you kind of hover over the bottom of your black.
Yeah, see, I minimized that and I'm having some trouble getting it back.
Okay.
Yeah, we did rehearse this before everybody got on.
Huh. Yeah, I don't know where it is. Yeah, I seem to have lost the toolbar.
Do you see view in the upper right?
No.
Okay.
Let's get this. Show presenter view, maybe? No. I don't know what's happening right now. I don't know why.
Okay, so let's,
Share screen. I think I found it back. Share. Okay.
Beautiful.
Okay, now I'm having some trouble getting the slide thing because there's a pop-up that's blocking it. Okay, can everybody
there
see
you
that
go.
now?
Perfect.
Okay. That's crazy. All right, I'm gonna minimize this box here. All right, we'll start over. All right, so trees, as opposed to shrubs, have one main trunk and can reach great heights, whereas shrubs will have several trunks, and they're usually quite small, under 20 feet tall. Now, trees that are cut may form stump sprouts, and they could be multi-stemmed, but they're still going to be much larger than shrubs. And red maple is a common example of a stump sprouter. You'll see several trees growing out of one little location. And we're going to focus just on trees with a couple of exceptions. Oh, all right. So the major tree groups are conifers and hardwoods. So conifers are cone-bearing, they're the gymnosperms, and the hardwoods are the flowering trees or the angiosperms. And the conifers are a small group of trees, at least around here. The hardwoods, quite large group of trees. So we're going to break those down into opposite leaf trees and alternate leaf trees, and then further break them down into trees with simple leaves and those with compound leaves. So this is just a little mini glossary of some terms you're going to want to know when you're looking at your field guide. So the twig is the newest growth on the tree. It's this season's growth. And the branchlet is the previous season's growth. And a leaf scar, this is the scar left behind by the leaf after it has fallen. So compound leaves have little leaflets and they will not bear these scars. So that is one way to tell a compound leaf from a regular leaf. So bundle scars are tiny circular dots within the leaf scar where the nutrients are transported to the leaf and leaflets. And we'll see a good picture of that in a couple slides here. A fascicle is a bundle or a tight cluster, and this is at the base of the pine needles. They're wrapped in a little sheath. Catkins are a spike of unisexual flowers, common in the birch family. A cone is a cluster of scales bearing naked seeds, common with all the conifers. Petiole is the leaf stalk, and a lenticule is a pore in the stem providing gas exchange with the atmosphere, and those are common in the birches. So these are the 5 groups of conifers. Pines, they have their needles in little fascicle clusters. Larches have their needles in spur branch clusters. Firs and hemlocks have flat needles. Spruces have sharp 4-sided needles. And what we call cedars have little scale-like leaves. So here are 2 pines, white pine and pitch pine. So white pine on the left there, they have really long cones, about 5 inches long. And the needles are a lot thinner than pitch pine, and they're in groups of 5. So this is our only pine that has needles in little groups of 5. And pitch pine on the right, our very common coastal plain pine, has needles in 3s, which you can kind of see in the picture here. And the cones are also armed with these very ferocious spines here. So if you grab one, it's going to hurt. And this is the only tree in the Northeast that has these spines on the cone scales. And it's also the only one with 3 needles. So just to follow up on that, white pine is the only 5-needle pine, and pitch pine is the only 3-needle pine in the Northeast. And pitch pine, again, is the only one that has spines on the cones. So all of the pines that you're going to see on Cape Cod are non-native to the Cape, although they may be native to New England, and they nearly all have 2 needles. So for example, red pine, Scotch pine, Austrian pine, Japanese black pine, and jack pine, if you find it, they all have 2 needles. So none of those are native to the Cape. And pine branch arrangement starts out in whorls. All the branches are opposite each other and like a little spoke. But pitch pine abandons that over time, and it gives it a nice irregular, attractive habit. So this is an example of a larch. Larches are not native to the Cape, but native to northern New England. You might find this growing occasionally. This is European larch, and you can see around the cones, you've got these little spur branches with the needles densely packed in them. And this is a deciduous conifer. So most conifers are evergreen. This one actually drops its needles in fall. All needles will do that. They'll turn yellow. And they're quite pretty in the fall. Oops. So conifers with flat needles, hemlocks and firs. These are also, you're only going to find these planted on the Cape. So hemlock, eastern hemlock has these really, really tiny needles with these tiny little cones. And balsam fir, which is native to northern New England, is you may find around, but it's also not native to the Cape. This is just an example of fir needles. So they have 2 white lines of bloom covering the stomata on the undersides of needles. And there'll be an explanation of what bloom is and stomata in just a couple slides, but you can see the 2 white lines underneath the needles and they actually have 1 white line on the top. So, but again, you're not going to find these growing native on the Cape. These are only going to be planted. So spruces are conifers with 4-sided needles. So there's no native spruces to the Cape, but Norway spruce is very common. It's a common plantation tree and grows very tall. They have drooping branches and long drooping cones. So spruce needles, when they come off, they leave a little short spur behind, giving the branches a rough feel and appearance, unlike the hemlocks and firs. So these are just a couple pictures of the Norway spruce. On the left, you can see the branches are drooping, and on the right is your typical spruce bark, which is scale-like. And here's an example of the little spurs that are left behind by the needles. So the needles are raised and they leave behind these little bumps when they fall off. And that whitish coating that you see on these needles, that is called bloom. And it coats stomata, and stomata exchange gases with the atmosphere. And because it can block out the sun, conifers growing in dense shade only have it on the needle's lower surface. So ones that grow out in full sun are going to have it all the way around. So this is Colorado blue spruce. It's also not native to the Cape, but this is a good example of the little spurs that you see on the twig. We have a couple cedars on the Cape. So this one is eastern red cedar. This is a pioneer species that grows in old fields. You will find larger specimens growing out in the forest. It is shade intolerant, so it's going to shed the lower branches when it gets into the shady part of the forest. It does have these little scale-like leaves, but actually has needle-like leaves when it's young, so that prevents some confusion to people. The little berries here, those are actually technically cones. It's kind of hard to see, but there's actually 3 little scales, but they're little fleshy cones. And common juniper is not very common on Cape Cod, but it also has sharp needle-like leaves, but it does not have scale-like leaves. So here's our other cedar, Atlantic white cedar. This is only found in freshwater swamps. So you can tell it from eastern red cedar just based on the habitat, but also by these little cones, these little woody cones that it produces, as opposed to the fleshy little bluish green cones of eastern red cedar. And just for comparison, this is northern white cedar, advertised as arborvitae in plantings. This has much wider scales. So this is a common tree up in Maine, but it does not grow in the wild here. But this is just for comparison. So moving on to our hardwoods. or the flowering trees, things to look for. Are the leaves arranged oppositely or alternately? Are the leaves compound or simple? Are the leaves egg-shaped or palmate? Palmate just meaning like fan-shaped. The size and arrangement of teeth, if any, on the leaf margins. The orientation of the leaf veins. Anything unusual about the bark, such as if it's shredding or deeply ridged. And if it's growing in shade, and if so, are the lower branches present? So this last one, aspens, they were going to drop their lower branches when they're growing in the shade. So they're only going to have branches high up on the tree in the forest. So bear in mind, and this is important, that leaves near the base of the tree or in dense shade are going to be much larger because they're trying to gather more sunlight. Conversely, trees growing out in direct sun or at the top of the tree are going to be a lot smaller. So here's an example of opposite versus alternate growth. On the left, we have a red maple. All maples produce leaves, flowers, branches in an opposite arrangement. You can see the two flowers growing opposite each other. Also, these white streaks on the stem, those are examples of lenticels. And lenticels, as we said, are exchanging gases with the atmosphere. And on the right, we have black tupelo. And this is an example of alternate branching. You can see the buds are coming out not opposite each other, but in an alternate arrangement. This is also a good example of leaf scars and bundle scars. So just below the buds here, there's this little scar, this triangular scar, where the leaf, the petiole leaf stalk has fallen off. And these three little circles that you see here, these are the bundle scars, which feed nutrients and water to the leaves. So simple versus compound leaves. On the top is a simple leaf of a dogwood species, and on the bottom is an example of a feather compound leaf from an ash. So leaves will bear a leaf scar, which we just saw, when removed from a branch or a twig. Leaflets from the compound leaf will not. So at the base of this ash, that's the only place it's going to leave a leaf scar. Where these leaflets fall off will not leave any sort of leaf scars. Just more about compound leaves. This is an example of an ash again, and this is in June, and ashes have compound leaves. So buds form in the axils of the compound leaves here. They're not going to see any buds forming where the little leaflets are. So there's going to be a leaf scar here where the compound leaf falls off, and also there's going to be a bud forming in these axils. So mad horse, a little acronym for the opposite leaf trees, maple, ash, dogwood, and horse chestnut. And this is a small group, so you can easily eliminate a lot of trees based on opposite versus alternate. And the picture here is horse chestnut. This is a European tree commonly planted on the roadsides. So the dogwoods have their leaves and branches growing opposite each other. This is a small tree with attractive flowers in springtime, often used in cultivation. So dogwood leaves have veins that follow the leaf edges. And if you carefully rip a leaf in two, the veins will leave behind a sticky substance connecting the two leaves. We'll see that in the next slide. So this flower here, these flower clusters actually in the middle. What you see growing out here, the white showy part, those are actually bracts that surround the flower cluster. So we do have several shrubby dogwoods in New England. One actually has alternate leaves. It's called alternate leaf dogwood. This is a pretty rare tree now. It's succumbed to a lot of diseases. So it's pretty lucky if you find one. So this is an example of the dogwood leaves. So on the left, typical dogwood leaves, you can see the veins follow the contour of the leaf. This is unusual in trees, so this is unique to the dogwoods. And over here on the right, if you carefully pull apart a leaf, you can see this sticky connective tissue that is also unique to dogwoods. So another opposite leaf tree are the ashes. We already saw the ash a few slides ago, but all ashes have opposite feather compound leaves with 5 to 9 leaflets. So these are all little leaflets on one big compound leaf. So you're not likely to see ashes out in the woods here. They're more common inland, and actually a lot of ashes are in trouble due to the emerald ash borer. It's going to probably destroy all the ashes in North America. But anyways, white ash is a tree of uplands. Green ash is a tree of damp soils. Very, very difficult to tell apart. Neither are very common here, so I won't spend a lot of time on the ashes. So maples are your other group of opposite leaf trees. I have 2 different species here, but red maple is our only native maple to Cape Cod. Although there are several, whoops, sorry about that. My name is blocking that word. So red maple is common in swamps, but it also occurs in uplands. And according to the Forest Service, it is the most widely distributed tree in North America. So on the left here, this is red maple. You can see it has very, very heavily serrated leaves that are sort of fan shaped. And just on the right, this is a comparison with sycamore maple, which is a European tree. And you can see this one has much more prominent veins. It also has serrated leaf edges, not quite as deep, but the veins are really prominent, a little more sunken in. So this is just a comparison photo. You won't find sycamore maple out in the woods. You will find red maple planted in addition to being in the woods. But this is a really common tree, the red maple of wetlands here, and it produces some really nice colors in the fall. So more about red maples. Red maples may have male and female flowers on separate plants or the same plant. They have round red buds and red twigs, which help identify them. On the left are the male flowers, on the right are the female flowers. These are red maple fruits called samaras, which make little helicopters when falling to the ground. And like everything else on the red maple, they are red. Now here's a European tree that's becoming a little bit invasive. This you will find growing in the woods. This is Norway maple. So its leaves are very similar to sugar maple, which is a common tree in New England, not on Cape Cod, unfortunately. But the petioles, when you crush a Norway maple, will emit a milky sap. And also the bark is quite different between Norway maple and sugar maple. Whereas sugar maple tree bark breaks into plates, this one has a little network of ridges. And the buds are also different. Norway maple has big round buds, kind of similar to a red maple, and sugar maple has pointed buds. So here's an example of the leaf of the Norway maple on the left. If you're familiar with sugar maple, you can see it bears a very strong resemblance. It does have a couple extra sets of lobes than the sugar maple. And on the right is a silver maple, and also not native to the Cape, but it's commonly planted here on the roadsides. They get very large. You can see these deep notches here. These are called sinuses. So whereas it's very similar to red maple with its heavily serrated leaf edges, these deep sinuses help separate it from red maple. And it also has the silvery lower surface. So moving on to trees with alternate compound leaves. We're only going to look at the first 3 here: black locust, pignut hickory, and markernut hickory. These other 2 hickories are very rare on Cape Cod, so we won't really touch on those. But before we do, let's talk about poison ivy, which also has compound leaves. So it is an alternate leaf, compound leaf shrub with its leaves in threes. Can grow as a vine or shrub, and the leaves can be quite large in the shady understories. So it can look very much like a hickory. And I almost started fondling these leaves thinking it was a hickory. So just be very careful, be very cautious. All parts of the plant contain ureasol, which is a skin irritant. And some people get it bad and some people get it really bad. Some people don't get it at all until later in their life, which is what happened to me. I was always not allergic to it, and then when I got into my 30s, I became terribly allergic. Some people go the other direction, where they might be really allergic and then over time become not allergic. All right, so back to our trees. So this is black locust, and this is a southern tree that's planted and spreading in New England. It was used for a long time as fence posts because it's very decay resistant. So on the left here, this is an example. It's got these compound leaves, quite a few leaflets, and it has these paired thorns, as you see on the right here. So these thorns are pretty distinctive. So it is a legume, so it can actually fix atmospheric nitrogen. So when you see a black locust, you quite often see a large, luxurious growth of grass underneath it. And this is an example of the flowers on the left. Typical pea-like flowers, which are actually edible. And on the right, it's got this pretty distinctive, heavily furrowed and deeply ridged bark. So that's also helpful to identify it. So on to our hickories. We've got two species on the Cape, pignut and mockernut. Pignut is the most common, and that's what's shown here, typically with 5 leaflets. So again, this is a compound leaf with one, oops. Darn that button. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 leaflets. Mockernut hickory typically has 7 to 9 leaflets, and they are actually spicy scented when they're crushed. So quite aromatic. The twigs are stouter in mockernut hickory, and they're more hairy. Although, as you can see, this pignut hickory is a little bit hairy also. Here's an example on the left of typical hickory bark. With tight ridges and cross thatching. And on the right, this is a mockernut hickory fruit, very round like a basketball. Pignut hickory fruits, unfortunately, I don't have a picture, are more oval or egg-shaped. So now we're moving on to the largest group of trees with alternate simple leaves. So when you start getting down here into the shad bushes, willows, and chestnuts, I think a lot of you are going to get heavy eyes and wish we had skipped over those, but we'll go through those pretty quickly. So American holly, this one is pretty distinctive. This is a southeastern tree that reaches its northern limit here on Cape Cod. And unlike most hardwoods, it is evergreen. So it does not drop its leaves in fall like most of the trees, most of the hardwoods around here. So the leaves are prickly. You can see the edges have these sharp spines. The flowers are small, white, and inconspicuous, and the berries are bright red. Here's an example of the berries, popular with birds and squirrels. Poplars, these are trees of dry soils, except cottonwoods, which don't grow native on the Cape. They have flattened petioles, which make the leaves shake and rattle in the wind. So when it's really windy, it will sound a little bit like rainfall when these leaves are shaking around. So here's our 2 common species, big-tooth aspen, and it is named for the large teeth that grow along the edges. And on the right is trembling aspen, also known as quaking aspen. And you can see in the edges of these trees, the leaf margins, the teeth are much smaller. So pretty easy distinction between the two. And again, this is shade intolerant. So if you find it growing in the forest, it's going to drop all its lower branches. And you may have to look up really high to see the branches. So American beech, this is a really attractive tree. It has long, singly toothed leaves with parallel veins. So here's an example of parallel veining on the tree leaf. It has long cigar-shaped buds in winter also, which help to identify it. Healthy specimens show smooth gray bark, but many of the trees here are infected with beech bark disease, and the bark is becoming very disfigured. And here's an example of some beech nuts growing at the base. So here's a nice little stand of beeches in Brewster. So they have smooth gray bark that resembles elephant legs. The trees here are actually splotched with lichens. These are healthy trees, but on Cape Cod, we have lots of lichens, which changes the color of the bark. A lot of the trees here, which would normally have dark bark inland, are quite light gray on Cape Cod due to all the lichens. And lichens are common here because of all the clean air that we have. So oaks, a confusing group of trees. There are several species all across America, and the greatest concentration is in the deciduous forest east of the Mississippi River. So Cape Cod has 7 species, with 2 of them being shrubs or small trees. Red oak, which is very common off Cape, is very rare on Cape Cod. I don't believe I've ever seen it, so we're not really going to talk about red oak. But the oaks do fall into 2 groups. So we've got the red oak group and the white oak group. And the red oak group has lobes pointed with bristle tips. So they've got like a little sharp tip at the end. And the white oak group has lobes rounded with no bristle tips. And we'll take a look at those. Starting with the bristle-tipped oaks, 2 very confusing oak trees, scarlet and black oak. On the left, we have a picture of scarlet oak, very deeply incised leaves. Again, these are called sinuses, but they're a pretty clean leaf, very free of hair or any fuzz. You might find a little bit of fuzz in some of the axils on the lower surface. But on the right, we have black oak, and its twigs, leaves, and petioles are all velvety, and it is called Quercus velutina because velutinous means velvety. So usually the black oak has the lobes that are widest toward the tips, but as you can see in this example, it also has deep sinuses, so it can be easily confused with scarlet oak, except for the dense hairiness. They do hybridize some, which complicates things, but you can usually find some good specimens with typical characteristics. So here's an example of the buds and the twigs. On the left, we have scarlet oak, which is a fairly smooth twig, and the buds are hairy, mostly just on the outer half. There might be a little area free of hair at the base. And on the right here, we have the very, very fuzzy black oak. So you can see the twig is fuzzy, the petioles are fuzzy, and the buds are all fuzzy, and they're strongly angled. And this is just an example of some variation within the black oak leaves. So it's really not straightforward. The one on the left here is sort of the typical black oak leaf, with lobes widest towards the tip. But as you can see, there's a lot of variation here. So moving on to an easier to identify oak. This is bare oak, also called scrub oak. It's common on the outer Cape, and its lower surface is very, very downy, soft and downy here. So it's pretty distinctive. And you can see the little bristle tips. It sort of has a little star-shaped look to it. And here is eastern white oak. Now, this is the group of white oaks that have no bristle tips. So you can see these lobes on this oak leaf. There's no bristle tips. They're nice and rounded. So white oak also has this very, very shreddy bark, and you can often identify it just by the bark. Another group in the white oak group is post oak. So this is a southern tree, like the holly, that reaches its northern limit here. It is actually common in the Mid-Cape, especially around Brewster's Quivet Creek. It has a very distinctive cross shape here. You can see the lobes in the middle extending out to form this cross shape. It also has very fuzzy leaves and twigs. Here's an example of the bark. It's got this deeply ridged bark. And on the right, an example of the fuzzy twigs, leaves, and petioles. So fuzzy like black oak, but the leaves very different from black oak. And this is just white oak and scarlet oak in comparison. So this is white oak on the left, pretty typical, smaller lobes at the base, getting a little bit bigger towards the middle, then smaller again towards the tip. And on the right is the cross-shaped leaf of post oak. Now, I'm not really sure, was I saying scarlet oak when I was talking about this? I meant post oak. I'm not really sure what I said, but so this is post oak. Okay, here is our shrubby oak, our last oak we'll look at, a dwarf chinkapin oak. This is an uncommon shrub that inhabits dry sites, and it has these wavy scalloped leaves with parallel veins, and there's just a little tiny little nub at the base, at the tips of these. So again, this is in the white oak group, not with large bristle tips. You can find this one at Crane Wildlife Management Area or any place that has habitat similar to that, dry and open. So we'll move on to our cherries. So this is black cherry. All species of Prunus, which is the genus of cherries, which includes plums and peaches, have paired glands at the base of the leaves and a pungent odor when you scratch the twigs. So I don't know if you can see at the base here of this leaf, there's some little paired glands. It's not really a good example. But if you scratch the twigs of any of these, they're going to give off a really nasty odor. And so the black cherry flowers are in these elongated clusters. The fruits are black and the leaves have a tuft of hair on the underside near the base. The leaves are wider than pin cherry, narrower than choke cherry. And the young bark will be dark with horizontal lenticels, so it can resemble a birch when it's young. So this is an example of the little fuzz that's going to grow at the base of a black cherry leaf. It doesn't have it initially, but it starts out sort of pale here. It will eventually turn rusty colored, and that is pretty distinctive when you find that. This is pin cherry. This is more common on the outer Cape. I see a fair amount of it in Truro. I don't really see a lot of it anywhere else. So it's got a lot more narrower leaves, and it has some pretty prominent veins here. So you can see that with the sunlight shining through. The veins here are pretty distinctive compared to the black cherry here. So here's just a picture of the underside of the leaf with no fuzz at the base. And this is why they call it pin cherry. If you look on the right side here, the red berries after the flowers have matured, they are on these little pins, little short stalks called pins. So that is the pin cherry fruit. And those fruits are red, as opposed to black or dark purple, like the black cherry or choke cherry. And here's our final cherry. This is choke cherry. It's usually a shrub, but the leaves are much wider than the other two species, and they have some pretty sharp teeth growing along the edges. No hair on the midrib. Here's an example of the fruits. You can see on the right here, the flower cluster is a bit wider than the black cherry. This is also something I see more on the Outer Cape in the Truro area. I work in Truro, so I see a lot of stuff in Truro that I might miss elsewhere. Getting away from cherries, here's sassafras. This is a fun tree. It has mitten-like leaves that may have 1, 2, or no thumbs. As you can see, there's an example of all 3 of those in here. You got your pretty typical simple leaf, then you got one with 1 thumb, and then you got one here in the middle with a thumb and a pinky, also on the right here. When you scratch a twig of sassafras, it's going to emit a real pleasant lemony odor. So unlike the cherries that'll emit a nasty odor, these will emit a nice, pleasant odor. And this is just a picture of the sassafras flowers, which should be starting to flower now. Black gum, Nyssa sylvatica. This is a species of freshwater wetlands. The branches have many short spur branches and tree tops that succumb to ice damage, so it gives it a unique flat top look. So these leaves have no teeth on them whatsoever. There's really nothing super unique about these leaves. They're just simple leaves with no teeth. They do turn a brilliant crimson in fall, and the berries are tart but edible. So here's an example of the little spur branches on a black gum. So all these little teeny little twigs make it pretty easy to identify even in winter when there's no leaves. So hop hornbeam, we're starting to move into our less common trees here. This is something in the birch family. So the leaves are egg-shaped and finely serrated, and this is an example of what they call double-toothed leaves. So if you look on the margins of this leaf, you can see a large tooth, and then there's actually a small tooth growing off of that bigger tooth. So we call that double-toothed, and that is a common trait in the birch family. Not very common on Cape Cod, probably more common in the Falmouth Sandwich area. And this is an example of the fruits, which are pretty distinctive. Hop-like fruits, so they call it hop hornbeam. The birches. So birch bark is marked with horizontal lenticels. Remember, lenticels provide a gas exchange with the atmosphere. So two not very common birches on Cape Cod. We got paper birch on the left. So the bark of paper birch peels off in these large plates, and in this one you're seeing what's left over from where the bark peeled off. So it's got white chalky bark. And on the right, this is black birch, which grows in the Mashpee Sandwich area. You can see its bark actually splits apart, kind of similar to the way sugar maple does. It does not peel apart, but it breaks, it just splits into these fissures. Both of these have egg-shaped leaves. And here is our common birch on Cape Cod, gray birch. This is a pioneer species, shade intolerant. You find it in a lot of clearings. It has bark similar to paper birch, but it does not peel off in large strips. It does not leave any chalky substance left on your hands when you peel it off or when you rub it. And the leaves are triangular at the bases. So whereas the other birches have really round egg-shaped leaves, this one has very triangular leaves. And this is an example of gray birch bark. It shows these black triangles where the branches form, and quite reddish when young. And there's the leaf, triangular shaped leaf, kind of in a rough shape. So moving on to some alders. This is a very confusing group of small trees and shrubs. Here's an example of catkins. These are the male flowers on the left, and the female flowers on the right over here. Alders can fix atmospheric nitrogen via root bacteria in the soil. So alders and legumes both can fix atmospheric nitrogen. These are common shrubs of wet areas, and we're not going to talk much about the alders. They're very confusing. This is an example of some mature catkins. You saw some immature ones on the last slide. So long drooping yellow catkins, these are the male flowers, and the little dark woody ones in the middle, those are the female flowers from last year, or cones rather. So this is actually European alder. I was hoping this was a native species, but is not. So shad bushes. So these are also called June berries and service berries. They're another confusing group of small trees and shrubs in the rose family. And in the wintertime, you can tell them by they have black tipped red winter bud scales. So it's got this oval shaped leaf with some sharp teeth on the margins. But the most distinctive thing about it is the white flowers that are blooming right around the time of the running of the herring, which are also known as shad. So that is why they're called shad bushes. These are blooming all over the place right now. So that way you know the herring are running. Here's an example of some of the flowers. We do have a couple of species of shad bush. I'm not going to really get into them, but one thing about the bark of shad bushes is they have some parallel lines. And so look for that when you see the bark. Willows, here's another confusing group of wetland trees and shrubs. I'm not going to talk much about them because they're really confusing, but they have these little wedge-shaped, narrow alternate leaves, and the buds form these pretty neat flowers in springtime, which people call pussy willows, but all willows produce these. American chestnut. This was once one of the most impressive trees in America, North America, but in the early 1900s, it succumbed to the chestnut blight. So the only trees you're going to find around here are small shrubs. So it's got long leaves, long toothed leaves, kind of similar to beech. It's got parallel veins, but longer teeth and actually much longer leaves than the American beech. They're actually developing hybrids with some more disease-resistant trees. So hopefully, eventually, we can get the American chestnut to come back. American elm, here's another tree that succumbed to a disease, Dutch elm disease, uncommon on Cape Cod, but elms have these uneven leaf bases. So if you can see at the base of this leaf, one comes out at a different point than the other. So it's got this uneven base here. The veins, mostly parallel, sharply. These may actually be triple-toothed leaves. So you've got a tooth here, and you got another tooth, and you got another tooth. These look like they're triple-toothed. But they also, a lot of elms have a very sandpapery surface. But again, this is not something you're likely to see. If you do, it's a good thing. And then finally, the basswoods and lindens. These are mostly our street trees, but apparently hoary basswood is growing wild on Sandy Neck. So it produces these little finely toothed, heart-shaped leaves, and the little papery fruits, papery flowers and fruits are really quite distinctive. But that is going to conclude this on our native trees. So we'll
Thank
go
you,
to
Tom.
questions. Should I minimize the screen
You could do that,
to hit stop share?
and then you could just,
Stop share. Okay.
all right. So there is one question in the chat box, and it is how to keep squirrels from eating our Japanese maple buds.
Oh
We
my
tried
goodness.
hanging metallic ribbons, but that didn't deter them.
Yeah, squirrels. So this is not really this is really more of a tree identification thing, but I'm going to tell you, if you discover one way to deter a squirrel, they're going to find some other way to deter your deterrent. Squirrels are just perseverant, very calculating. I don't know that there's anything you can do about squirrels. I'm sorry. That's the way it is with squirrels.
So it says last year was tough on our trees and shrubs. How should we help them now?
Well, again, not an identification question, but I would imagine just keeping them watered, because last year a lot of things was really stressed out because of the drought. As long as the trees are getting enough water, that should help them. Again, plant nutrition is really not my area. This might be a question for a gardener. CL Fornari, for example, she has a good website on gardening. So she actually has a Facebook group too. What's it, Cape Cod Gardening? I would present your questions to her about the health of your plants.
Well, thank you. So is there a difference between the holly shrubs in front of our home and what you described as holly trees?
Oh, yes. So actually the berry photo that I used was a planted shrub that's growing out in front. There are numerous varieties of hollies. If you go to the Ashumet Holly Sanctuary, there was a fellow there that created like 17 or 18 different varieties of hollies. So there's English hollies and all sorts of different variations. So the short answer is yes. Yeah, basically, yes, there are differences. If you find it growing out in the woods, that's going to be our native American holly, and the ones growing in your garden here are likely a cultivated variety.
All righty. And then we have a question. Is the silver leaf poplar native? And is that also the quaking poplar?
No, so that's a good question. I did not have a picture of that. So this white poplar, it is another European or Eurasian tree, and it has maple-like leaves that are very, very fuzzy on the bottom, and they are not native to Cape Cod. But there is quite a large stand of them growing in the Pilgrim Spring area. It seems like they're a little bit invasive there. Was there another half to that question?
Is that the quaking poplar?
No, okay, no. Quaking aspen is it's actually one of the two trees that I showed you in my aspen slide, also known as trembling aspen. That is a native tree. The white poplar is not a native tree.
Great, thank you. Any other questions for Tom?
What trails do we
Okay.
recommend for best variety? Yes, Ryder Conservation Land in Sandwich. That has got the best variety of anywhere that I've seen around here. You can access it off of Route 130 and right around the Sandwich Mashpee town line. There's also another entrance on the other side, but you have to pay to get in that way. There's also a Trustees of Reservation trailhead. I think it's South Sandwich Road. But anyway, so that area of the Cape has a better variety of trees. So the glacial moraine that was left over there was sort of like a string of hills. At one time, Cape Cod was almost completely denuded of trees, and some of the trees were spared in that area, and it was not gardened quite as heavily because of all the rocks. So you've actually got deeper soils in the Sandwich, Mashpee, Falmouth area. So you're gonna get more of your black birches, witch hazel. What else we got out there? There's a chance you might see native hemlock and red oak growing over there. I haven't seen it, but that's also where you're going to find hop hornbeam. So Ryder Conservation Area, yes, you can see about 25 different species of trees. A few of them are non-native, like the Norway maple and sycamore maple, but that is a really, really good thing, good diverse habitats.
Terrific. Well, thank you, Tom.
Yeah, I'm going to plug in my computer because I got the low battery notice.
Okay, so I'm going to just remind folks, we have Tom doing a tree identification walk at Barclays Pond in July. You can sign up on our website for that. And also want to give a plug out for, we have a book club meeting monthly, the first Monday of the month. And this past, I think that they chose just books by John Hay this past month. So if you're interested in that, also on our website. And I think that's all we have. Thank you so much again, Tom. We look forward to seeing you in July.
Okay.
Again, all recordings from our webinars are going to be found on our website, and we'll be sending out a copy of Tom's slides to everyone who participated. Thanks so much. There's something else in our chat. Just lots of thank yous. All right.
Yeah, just a reminder. So there's probably a lot of information in here. We covered a lot of trees, but like Lauren said, you can see the PDF when it gets sent to you, and you can look at everything at your leisure and just learn it a little bit at a slower pace. Only had an hour to go through all that stuff. So.
Well, the slideshow will help me again, Tom.
Yeah.
I thank you so much, and we look forward to seeing you in July.
All right.
All right. Take care.
Okay, you too.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Terrific. Thank you, Tom.